For the final panel, we're going to be talking about the future. And one of the reasons I actually wanted to bring this event together is because there's so much great work that's going on in the field of polarization research and intervention. And many of these folks are really hungry for more connection between them and their work, and and just to have a real network. And many of these folks, they want to ensure a pipeline of future scholars who are ready to join them. So now we want to focus on building a community of practice, starting here in the DC area, but also including the incredible labs and programs that exist around the country and throughout the world even. So I'm really excited to hear more about how we connect the research being done around polarization within academia and the practice of building bridges in communities, which is just a really essential link. So we'll be talking about really both of those things. So I want to introduce the panelists. Dr. Karina Korostelina is a professor at the Carter School at George Mason and director of both the Sustainable Peace Lab and the program in History, Memory, and Conflict. She's a social psychologist whose work focuses on dynamics of social identity and power in protracted social conflicts, and has done a lot of work in her native Ukraine and places around the world. And I had the pleasure of taking her identity and conflict class as the first step in my master's program, which was really, I felt, a perfect place to start. So welcome, Professor Korostelina. Rachel Milner-Gillers is a professor of the practice in negotiation and conflict resolution at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, where she leads the Conflict Transformation Lab. And she trains Georgetown students in the art of negotiation and peace building. And as a mediator and facilitator, she's worked with everyone from businesses and nonprofits to governments and even UN negotiators. So welcome, Professor Milner-Gillers. And Dr. Daniel Rothbart is the Drusilla French Chair at the Carter School at George Mason, where he's also co-director of the program on prevention of mass violence, and he leads the Transforming the Mind for Peace lab. And he's done extensive research on the conflicts in Sudan, including helping document human rights violations during the current civil war. And actually, together, he and Professor Korostelina developed the theory of collective axiology, which describes how parties to a conflict deeply misunderstand one another. And we heard earlier in the earlier panel about how we have really robust data about how the two sides within the political conflict in this country actually deeply misunderstand one another. So I thought that was really interesting. And this theory has really helped to frame up our conflicts for me in a really helpful way. And I've also had the great pleasure of working with Dan and learning from him at the Carter School in many different contexts. So welcome, Professor Rothbart.
Thank you, Randy.
And then finally, I also want to welcome a panelist that we are so grateful that was able to join us. He was originally scheduled to be on the first panel, but was unable to make that one. So we're really grateful that he's joined us now. Dr. Daniel Brumberg, I mentioned before, he's the co-founder and former director of the Democracy and Governance Master's Program at Georgetown, and helped create the In Your Shoes project that you heard about before. That's using theater and performance to foster dialogue across divides, and it's part of the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics. And I mentioned that I had the privilege of seeing that project in action because Dan did bring me in through Braver Angels to work with one of his classes, and so that was a real pleasure. So please welcome Professor Brumberg. And I will turn the panel over to you, Isaac.
Thanks, Randy. All right, great. So I think just as like a framing thought for the panel and to get everybody in the right mindset, I think after our first two panels this morning and this afternoon, the goal of this is to try and leave here with maybe some solution-oriented thinking. And, it's a good segue because we sort of started discussing it towards the end of the last panel about the things that work, what gives us optimism, and how we might be able to build off of the gathering that's here today. Professor Korostelina, I want to actually start with you on this one because you've done a ton of work on peace building and studying conflict internationally. You've written more books than I have journal entries, seemingly, about this stuff. And I really want to hear from you about some of the things that you've seen that have worked in some of the more entrenched, most difficult conflicts that we've seen, maybe not just here in the US, but also globally, because I think something we started to scratch at in the last panel was tactics and methods that might actually work to de-escalate in the world that we live in today.
I need to pick it up. Yeah. Can you hear? Yeah. Thank you very much. I first of all really want to express my deepest gratitude for Randy to organizing this event and Ksenia helping him and for other groups who are here to help. And I'm extremely happy to be here among colleagues and students. So it's a wonderful enabling environment. So when we talk about global big conflict or significant conflicts, it's always easy to think to approach them from macro strategy, from liberal peace building, bringing ideas of peace and justice. And we really think how every group, I'm not just speaking about ethnic or religious group, but even regional groups can have very different meanings of what peace and justice means. And for example, in our work with Dan in Sudan, we found that 3 different regions of Sudan have completely different meaning what justice means. For some, it was restorative justice for bringing more back economic development. For others, it was restoring their communities and building bridges across different divides within communities. And for others, it was the security. So even the meaning of it differ. So then we approach peace building. Then we approach what I call sustainable peace. We really need to think about ways how different communities with different dynamics of power and identity see peace, and sustainable peace only possible when we address all these differences in meanings, different variations in the way how people see it, see peace and justice. So sustainable peace, it's mean addressing dynamics of identity and power and intergroup relations. And what I found recently, there are 2 projects which I very quickly can give some lessons learned, which I recently working on. One project is we completed actually Jeff, I hope he's still here, together with Jeff and some other colleagues, analyzing a role of identity and religion in peace processes. And we analyzed 12 different peace processes to find what worked, what didn't work, and why it works. And based on it, I was able to develop a bridge framework for identity-based conflict and identity-based peace building, which really stress multiple 5 major strategies, around 20-something tactics and a lot of specific tools, which able, for example, one of the key for conflicts, very rarely, even in United States, because we think about polarization, like still there are a lot of power dynamics. And most of conflicts always asymmetric, at least people in conflict. Even we see some conflicts, oh, it's pretty symmetric polarization. No, because every side see it as asymmetric power dynamics. So how to address, how to balance the power, how to bring opportunities for people who have less power, like minorities, how to build coalitions, for example, of minorities together. How to address conceptual barriers between how policies are decided and created and how communities see implementation of these policies, right? This is how to, it's just few ideas how to address power dynamics. It's also idea how we create these bonding strategies. What I found in many other places, I just came back from Armenia and Georgia, and I done a lot of work in Ukraine, but it was interesting for me to hear in Georgia the same way. We need to build more civic national identity. We should not develop ethnic conceptual idea, Georgian for Georgian, Ukraine for Ukrainians, and all of that. So this idea, what I found from 12 peace processes, that if you build civic meaning of national identity, it means then doesn't matter what political party you belong to. Doesn't matter what ethnicity you belong to or what language you speak. We all equal citizens. It's horizontal comradeship of people who have responsibilities and rights, and this civic meaning of national identity sustain peace processes. When people start developing ethnic or even multicultural meaning, we saw peace processes were not sustained at all. And of course, inclusion, it's very important, inclusive strategies, which show that we are not only have to bring parties together, but we need to teach them skills how to communicate. This is actually Rachel will be probably talking about. Because what I found again in sustainable peace processes, if you just bring people together in the national dialogues or in ethnic groups together or minorities or indigenous groups, and you do not provide them base how to conduct dialogue, how to engage in deliberations, how to engage across divide, it doesn't work. And this, again, I just told several strategies, again, it's a whole framework. But it's bringing me to another project which I'm working on how to make contact works. And we know people bring together groups. Okay, let's put people in a room. People will communicate, discuss, and it will work. And we found that even the most experienced practitioners who work across the globe, and I now working with 9 projects from Libya to Bangladesh, from Fiji to Benin. So in these projects, what we found, if people do not really understand conditions of contact, what I called free T's, trauma, threat, and trust, do not understand horizontal dynamics and vertical power issue, then they will never make contact work. So this is very important, this really to learn, reflect on all practices which work. So I think learning specific tool sets and promoting and teaching about them, this is what can be. I hope it's quick answer.
Yeah, you did a bit of foreshadowing there, because Professor Milner-Gillers, I want to hear from you about your work. I think it's relevant, especially here, because you work with students on campus. And, I know from emailing back and forth with you a little bit about your work that sometimes this kind of conflict polarization work embodies, the rural-urban divide, Israel-Palestinian conflict. I'm interested if you could talk a little bit about your approach, what you actually do with these students, and how you kind of help turn them not just from people who can discuss these issues with each other, but also, it sounds like, facilitators of more conversations in the future.
Thank you. It has been noted by a few of our colleagues today that one of the biggest drivers of polarization is this perception that that our opinion will be diminished if we in any way listen to or understand another's. In other words, thinking about Ezra Klein and his view of polarization as being one in which people feel like the other person's view, if realized, will lead to the apocalypse. If that's the way that you think, then you're going to have a really hard time building bridges and wanting to build bridges. And I'm thinking of the student who is, or the person who is sitting over here and wondered, why would a conservative want to participate in depolarization, right? And I have some thoughts about that. I will say that in my experience, it has been hard to recruit conservatives to participate. It's not a surprise to me, however. I think about something that has happened somewhat annually in the recent past. At the McCourt School of Public Policy, we do foundations, an orientation program that is sort of a mini course, and I do a session on difficult conversations. And I put students into, it's a skill building session, and I put students into, into small groups, and I ask them to, to play out listening to someone take a position that is the extreme opposite of how they feel. And it's uncomfortable. But they have to do it, and all they're allowed to do is to actively listen. And the group is watching as this happens. They sort of do it in fishbowl. And I have noticed that when someone is playing a conservative point of view, right, they can say whatever they want to say because the listener, the one who's practicing, has to only listen and acknowledge. When conservative points of view are played out, people giggle. And they don't even always know, and so I'll just pause there for a second and say, and then I'll get to the end of my session and I'll say, listen, my invitation to you is to get into the conversations while you're here. Better to practice here than when you go out and do policy making in the real world. And then something like October 7th happens. And we wonder, why are students not engaging constructively around this? And the election's coming. Why aren't students engaging constructively around this? Well, because no one thought in their confirmation bias world, no one thought in that group there might be someone who's actually conservative and uncomfortable with that giggling. So I've now started to help students be aware of when they're doing things like this. So my point of view really is mostly about the student experience, though it's informed by work that I've done in the field for a long time. So we primarily at the Conflict Transformation Lab, we're doing skill building around negotiation, collaboration, empathy in its role in negotiations, dignity, and the like. And we were having dinners with practitioners, and I thought this is the right mix, right? We've got the skill building and we've got the engagement with people who are doing the real work. And then again, something like October 7th happens, and everyone is paralyzed. And not just the students, that paralysis, it wasn't just the students, it was our institution, right? Our institutions. How many organizations struggled and stayed up late nights trying to figure out how to craft statements? Should they not? What's going to happen to me if I do or if I don't? And I feel like that paralysis actually really undermines our efforts to combat polarization. And when I think about that, I think about the fear that comes from, so it's not just the fear of institutions and responding. It's not just the students fearing what might happen if they share of themselves, right? If they expose their identities that some people feel like they have to hold really close, if not disguise at this point, given how people might respond. It is also, I would even say, like my fellow faculty members, and I don't know if this resonates here, but even, well, probably not in this crowd, but fellow faculty members who don't necessarily have experience engaging around conflict, who don't want to touch this for fear of all kinds of potential repercussions, in the moment and maybe, globally given social media. And I also think about how we've talked a little bit about how social media plays in the online disinhibition effect, which was studied way before we got into our Zoom life and everything, shows us that, that it's not just a perception that people act, more egregiously online. They don't feel accountable, and they're less ethical. And these are people who would never, ever want to be characterized as bullies face-to-face and in the real world, but what they're doing when they're trolling is truly bullying. So all of these things, I think, inhibit students from wanting to talk. But also, we expect, I think we're moving, actually, I have something positive to share, which is I'm starting to see students self-organize around having conversations on difficult issues in a way that wasn't happening in previous years. But why should we expect, if A, we don't necessarily have a hospitable environment for people with different opinions, and B, we also don't necessarily give enough skill that can be put into practice, and then give guidance along the way. It's a very high touch, and so maybe unrealistic for universities, but I really truly feel like higher ed has a big responsibility in helping to combat polarization, because it starts, I think, actually our colleague was showing videos to, was it preschoolers or just all the way, all the way up. I think that it's important for us to start early, but I really do feel like higher ed is where students are putting theory and practice together, and we have a big responsibility. So in addition to trying to create those environments, I think we just need to keep iterating and keep iterating, because the nature of the conflict is changing, but we also can't throw up our hands either, because I do think that the way that students are willing to engage is evolving. And I've can say more about the specifics. But
Yeah, I'm curious, just really quick to follow up. I mean, it's, we have a room full of people who clearly care about this issue, and I'm hearing like some inklings of advice there, like be more conscious of the unconscious things you're doing, like giggling when somebody's playing the role of a conservative. I mean, I'm wondering if you have any advice for people who want to put some of this stuff in practice. I mean, people literally in this room who want to put some of this stuff in practice and be a part of the solution, how they should approach it or what kind of mindset they should have going into it.
absolutely. I think one of the hardest parts about this work is that it's not the type of thing you can typically do in one session. So one thing I would do is to, if you are going to do any kind of process, and this may be obvious, make sure that you're dedicating multiple sessions to that. Last year, initially, when in the post-October 7th environment, we had to have sort of one-time engagements for people, just depending on where they were, what they were feeling, and who they were willing to be around. But then ultimately, when we started talking, we made sure we set up a 3-part series. And the first part, of course, needed to involve community building. I think people have talked about this now a few times. If you have the relationships and you have the rapport, then you build the trust that's necessary to have these conversations. So investing in that community building piece is really essential. I also think that who is convening is really important, and being very deliberate and thoughtful about that, while also understanding that we may not always have the identities that we want represented in the facilitators present. There's a tension, I think, often between subject matter expertise and someone who's just really good listener. And where they come from in their background, that people are looking for and they're going to poke at when they think about whether they want to trust a process. And I would say, I think that we need to be more forgiving of ourselves, and we need to encourage with our students to be more forgiving, or participants, to be more forgiving about all of those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good answer. Professor Rothberg, I'm going to come to you first, and then Professor Brumberg right after. I'm curious. I mean, we're talking about some strategies, real world examples of how to approach these conversations. Your work at Transforming the Mind for Peace Lab, you have a different approach in some ways that I think is more rooted in some of the science around this stuff and depolarization. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that work and kind of what we know about the science of having these conversations and getting people to let their guard down a little bit.
Okay, thank you very much. One of our challenges is to take the work that we and others have done on extremists and then extend that to the country as a whole. So there's extremist studies, lots of work on extremist studies, and our frame, along with many other people, from this research about extremists is that extremism of all spectrums, political spectrums, is deeply emotional. That there are layers and layers of intense emotional sentiments which become politicized. So the emotions then become a political weapon. For example, all extremists define themselves by the threat of their adversary. That's virtually universal. But what that threat is psychologically is fundamentally an emotional characterization of the other as degenerate, as less than human, as dangerous, which is fundamentally an extreme emotional thing, and for which we are enraged. So the move on that theme from rage in the extremist studies to the nation, I think, is powerful. In other words, from our studies, polarization is fundamentally an emotional experience where rage becomes a very common sense of self-powerment, which of course becomes a weapon. And this is obvious with right-wing extremists. It's also prevalent with social progressives who are extremists. Social progressives exhibit very clear signs of rage, which becomes somewhat self-satisfying. So when we are enraged by the evils of the other, this becomes both personal, because it's my rage. Nobody can question the validity of my rage. I own it. No one can challenge that. But it's also our rage. So the rage becomes a unifying force within the extremists. And I see this as very common even for groups that are not extremists. That is, groups that are, politically active, who are not violent, and so on. So that's an example of the emotional layering of polarization. And I think the political crisis in this country is a deeply social, psychological, political crisis. So in terms of how should we respond to this? Well, there's a number of things. I'm going to just mention a couple things that we should not do. Don't bother fact-checking your opponent. That is a waste of time, and that becomes just another point of contention. Example, debates about the cause of the Civil War are obviously very intense in certain sectors of the nation. And correcting your opponent who says that states' rights basically was the source and so on, and it wasn't slavery and so on. Well, historically, obviously true. The historians have demonstrated that without any doubt. But in the context, in the emotional intensity of an enraged society, the kind of fact-checking and historical thing, that then just intensifies and angers the person. So anger, where obviously anger is also a deeply fundamental element of polarization today, fact-checking then becomes another source of anger and denigration of the opponent. So fact-checking is not a good idea. Second thing, since this was brought up, I think Rachel made excellent points. We should all, to use a cliche, we should all look in the mirror and really take a deep look at how we my circles are social progressives, so everybody I know is social progressives, but our research basically shows that social progressives basically do certain things to aggravate the polarization, as we just heard. So presumptions or giggling or something about an audience. So I think it's very important to recognize that in a certain way, all sides are aggravating the tensions, and we need to step back and really take a kind of humble, modest view about ourselves in the conflict. So that's just a couple of things that I think really reflect the psychological aspect of the conflict.
So we've got strategies about deconflict in global context, talking to students on campus and how to facilitate these conversations, the science of polarization. Professor Brumberg, I'm going to talk to you and come to you with a question about the media here in the United States. I know a lot of your work revolves around polarization in the U.S., and I think in our first two panels, we did a pretty good job kind of setting the table that the media and a lot of the platforms where people are consuming information are helping increase the polarization that we have. So I have a little bit of a curveball on that to you, which is how might our media ecosystem in the United States be a part of the solution rather than, contributing to making the problem worse in the context of some of the polarization challenges that we have here? I mean, are there ways that you see that we could actually, our media institutions could actually help bring the country together rather than continue to divide them, which I think we feel like they are doing right now?
Well, you threw a fastball at me, and I'm probably going to dodge it because, as I noted in an email to Randy, and by the way, apologize for not being able to make it here this morning. I think, given the nature of the marketplace in the United States, and given the unregulated ways in which the marketplace operates, there's very little to stop a major owner of a significant domain in the media from arguing that, or letting people argue that the hurricane which is hitting Florida now is a Jewish conspiracy. This is, a remarkable thing. But one of the things I've learned in the course on polarization I've taught is that the incentives are all there not to depolarize. And I really don't have a good answer for your question. I don't think, given the structural incentives within the media, it's very hard to imagine how we can step outside of those arenas, those self-enclosed arenas, and create alternatives because we live in an economy that's basically fueled by capitalism. Let me put it bluntly.
Well, maybe I can follow up then a little bit. I mean, from your view then, what should we as consumers of the media understand about it? I mean, maybe you can speak to those incentives.
Be honest with you, I was going to take this a little bit differently, and I'm going to try to be very quick because I realize we ought to have some time to discuss this with our audience. I mean, I think we all understand what the media does in the United States. It creates this environment in which our prejudices are reinforced. And when we are reintroduced, or when we are introduced to other ideas which compete with those prejudices, our commitment to the prejudice are only reinforced. The research shows that the effort to show the other side, right, only compels people to cling more fiercely to their own assumptions. And I think it's really hard to walk away from this, given the way the media is operating, particularly in the United States. Now, the way the media works now is it not only provides an arena for reinforcing assumptions, but it really doesn't do anything about the fundamental problem, which I thought all of you, of course, discussed today, and that is, in our daily lives, from the moment we get up now, and I was talking to my students last night about this, to the moment we go to bed, we don't have any interactions with other people that let us experience their humanity. To put it in the briefest way I can. We have all kinds of words for this in political science: social capital, trust. Every time I hear the word trust, I hear it defined by its own terms. Right? What do we mean by trust? Well, we believe in people. What do we believe in people? We trust them, and we don't. But the reality is that in our daily lives, we don't have, and this is, I'm going to draw this to the question of practice in a moment. We don't have those arenas in which we don't experience people politically, but we experience them as human beings, right? And we know the famous book Bowling Alone is just one example of the multiple arenas that have disappeared from the lives of Americans, so they don't experience on a daily basis what it is to interact with somebody in a zone which is not political and not about politics, and is about experiencing the other person as a human being and developing that emotional response, because the media feeds the other emotional response. And if people are on the media time and time again, I would wager to say that the science of it is altering the way people experience pleasure. That's the fearful thing. And what used to give people pleasure, and I gave my students this example last night, so you used to go to something called blockbuster movies, and you'd go in there, and because nobody, they don't know what I'm talking about. They only see movies. I said, you go in there, and here's what happens. You're looking at a movie, and you say to the person next to you, what do you think of that movie? And then you talk to somebody else, and you've had an experience of other people's humanity in that store. And we used to have the same thing at Safeway. And we used to have, there are multiple arenas, and they've just disappeared. And what has replaced the experience of getting what I call the humanity fix multiple times in a day is the opposite. It's the media. And the tribalization of the media, and so it's very hard to look at the tribalization of the media without thinking about how we deal with this absence of arenas in which people can experience each other not as political animals, but as human animals. And that may sound flowery, but I really think it's a major driver of what sustains this media environment, because people are only experiencing things in a tribal context and not on a human level. And I say this because there are really two ways to think about, I think, the kinds of strategies that have probably been discussed here today. One is to have important and useful conversations and to learn to have conversations about hot button issues in ways that will create respect for the other person's views, but also might create an element of consensus. And there's a vast literature on this and how to do it, and it's very important. The other thing to do, and this is what we did in your shoes, is to say we're not about trying to reach political consensus. We're not even going to talk about political issues to begin. What we're going to do is to get people in a room, and we're going to get them to tell their lives and then step into the shoes of the other person and become that person and tell their life. And what they're going to do is have an experience that gives them the pleasure of interacting with people about non-political issues and recognizing their humanity and their experience and getting a sense of what it, and this, what Rachel's saying is very important. You can't do it once, you can't do it twice. When we started in your shoes, we did it for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. We kept going back to Virginia and bring the group back here because you have to develop this sort of sense of trust and your sense of empathy. And that is explicitly organized around non-political issues. Of course, when you give a prompt like belief or a prompt like family, it's full of politics, right? But the students are asked to talk about that experience, not from a political point of view, but from a personal. I think it's very, very powerful. And so I'm here, obviously, to make a pitch for that kind of work. And let me just say this, and I'll wrap up. Students are craving these experiences. Because when you're in environments in which you are required to conform, you're actually very lonely. Everybody sort of agrees, everybody is reiterating, and people have this desire, we discovered it in your shoes, to step out of that world. Because it's crushing, it's lonely. And they don't really have conversations within those arenas, and this was true at Patrick Henry and at Georgetown, about their lives. In neither community were they experiencing stories of their lives. It's all politics, or in one version or the other. So what's enticing about students, and this is the pitch, is to say, you know what, we have this theater experience. And this experience is going to give you an opportunity to experience other people in other ways that and the joy and the difficulty of doing that in a way that's enticing and in a way that opens up a door. Because, of course, stepping into it, initially, what is affecting everybody, particularly in the case of Patrick Henry students, was fear and distrust about what was going on. But if you frame it as an opportunity to go back to that video store, as it were, and have those experiences and learn about people in a way you haven't before, it's challenging, it's vulnerable, but it's also very compelling. So I think how you frame the opportunity makes a big difference.
If I could just add to one of your points, I think there are so many forces in society today that are forces against empathy. And one realm, as you point out quite correctly, is, of course, the media broadly defined. And I don't mean small, social groups. There's many studies have shown that media basically have an overabundance on negative stories, obviously violence and so on. And the emotional reaction for most stories about violence is who did it? Who were the source of violence? I'm not talking about hurricanes in Florida. Obviously, we're talking about killings and so on. The media are structured to promote this for, as you point out correctly, for capitalists, for selling and so on. This has a deeply powerful effect on individuals and the political mind, the political ethos. And it takes, obviously, weeks and years and so on. There's lots of studies in neuroscience basically showing how long it takes to change. In other words, the structure of the mind is impacted by repetition of emotionally intense experiences. And I don't know about you all, but when I see another story It's very difficult for me to watch TV about another killing because it's emotionally disturbing. It's even hard to read it on a paper, on the Washington Post. So this is something, I don't have a quick solution, but the forces against empathy and humanizing, which of course is a very complicated process. What does it mean to be human? Minimally it means, and this is kind of, I'm hoping a positive point, is to be curious about the other. So one of our projects in our lab is to study curiosity. Can I be curious about that right-wing extremist who advocates the need for violence? Imagine that. Imagine that we not only could be, but maybe we should be. Why would that person, and without suspending judgment for at least a few minutes, why would the member of the Oath Keepers advocate violence in this or that on January 6th? And to really sympathetically listen. Now, obviously, violence should be subject to criminal prosecution, but short of something extreme like that is just very rare. And I think promoting the skill, as you point out correctly, of curiosity is a positive step.
Please go ahead. Yeah. No.
Okay. I was thinking about the idea of framing, and this actually I could connect to advice for people who want to start initiatives, especially students who might want to start initiatives, bringing people together. Framing is really important, and I feel a little bit guilty myself about, you're saying that the media set us up in certain respects. I feel like the language that we choose when we're talking about a conflict already starts the polarization. Like, for example, my program on the rural-urban divide. Number one, it doesn't end up being squarely rural students and urban students and a divide. What we actually learn, and the whole point of the program is that we have kind of a range in terms of geographic range. This is with students generally from Georgetown and from Radford University in Southwest Virginia. We do have a lot of urban students. We do have a lot of rural students, but we also have suburban students, or depending on how people define. And what we come to learn through just even some questionnaire we do prior to the program is, debunking some of the myths around, life in rural America and in urban America, and how divided are we really? And so I feel like I'm kind of perpetuating this a little with a program it's called Power of Dialogue, very nice, but bridging the urban-rural divide, so rural-urban divide. So that's one. Another is when we talk about language. So actually, I referenced activity we'd done around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, that was precipitated by events of last year. But if you think about it, that's also a strange way to frame the conflict. Israeli-Palestinian, it is so much bigger than that. So much bigger, and especially as we learned last year. So we're limiting ourselves and the potential for transformation by the language that we use when we're talking about the conflicts, even as we're talking about things like victims and victimizers, and how people put people into boxes. I'm also thinking about a session we recently did on, it was called Free and Inclusive Speech. I think the rest of it was What Will You Do With Yours? As I'm thinking about language, we have legal definitions, right, that the United States has created for us. We have policy within the university around limitations on free speech. And then what we tried to encourage students to do was to think about, okay, where else should we go in our thinking about the limitations that we might want to have on ourselves when we think about the language that we use? And I'm actually thinking back to an event, actually first a piece, I think it was in the New York Times, by the deans of SIPA at Columbia and at the School of International Public Affairs at Princeton, talking about, first of all, encouraging people to talk, but then about, in a live event that they did, Amani Jamal from Princeton said, look, nobody wants to limit anybody's free speech. Nobody wants to do that. But we need to question, if we really want to transform this thing, if we don't want to stay in the mess and in the depression of polarization, we need to question the language that we're using. Can we say it? Sure. Should we say it? Maybe not. Just depends on what your goal is. And so I would say by way of advice, maybe at the start of one of these processes, have a conversation about what it means to, what freedom of expression means without inspiring fear that people will self-monitor the entire way because of worry that they'll use language that's not acceptable.
Can I
Please.
just quickly? So what I'm hearing here, it's just really music to my ears because you're specifically speaking all about the conditions for good contact and how to make contact really important. And this pleasant contact is one of the key conditions for successful contact. How we bring people together across divide so they actually can enjoy the experience. And a lot of opportunities to use art, theater, use ways, music, use games, very important part. But also in addition to this pleasant contact, you really need to think about these 3 T's, which I'm talking about, the threat. Because think about it, half of the country thinks that another half of the country will destroy it completely. If you think that another is imminent threat to the government, to everything, right? To state, to the nation, and so on. So then half of the country thinks the same of another half of the country. So this continuous use of the threat. Do you know what's the difference between danger and the threat? Anyone? Mm-hmm.
Well, danger is right now.
Uh-huh.
Could be imminent and have different effects that lead to more danger.
Very good. Threat is intention. Danger is dangerous to walk on a wet floor. But does floor really want to kill you? Not, right? Threat is an intention. And this is what we attributed to the other group which drives the polarization and conflict. And if we are not dealing with the meaning of safe spaces, before you plan any contact between across political divide, you need to actually ask people, what does it mean for you to feel safe? What's the meaning of safe space? How do you feel threat? What threats you anticipate from other group? And design of the process of dialogue, of engagement, should include these meanings together. This is what we do internationally. Why we could not do it in United States? I do it in Benin, I do it in Bangladesh, I do it in Fiji, right? So why we could not do it here? Similarly, if you look like in Senegal, was a really huge issue of integration former combatants, victims, right? How you deal with it, which is also connected with the idea of truth. What Dan was telling, fact-checking, there are multiple truths. There are multiple ways. Again, then it sounds like, but think about rain, right? Rain is a truth. But some people tell, oh my gosh, rain, wonderful. I don't need to go and water my flowers. I'm so happy. Somebody tell, oh my gosh, I just made my nice hair and it will disappear, right? So it's a different meaning of the same simple rain. If we speak about social events, social dynamics. Of course, there are multiple social meanings, right? So what we call agonistic approach, when you can, especially if concern the history, where there are multiple interpretations of the same event. Acceptance, agonistic approach means then you can actually accept different interpretation and understand that there are different ways how people see the situation, which also address, going me to this, I'm going to so-called 3 T's, to the trauma, because I think Rachel was telling about this idea of not accepting other point of view, but we also never accept other people's trauma, because trauma is a zero-sum game. If I accept somebody else's victimhood, I am taken from my victimhood, and I accept somebody else's trauma. So this competition, who is most victimized, who is most traumatized, contribute to these 3 T's. And this is what we need to address. We need to think in advance, design the process together with both groups. What does it mean? Do you feel traumatized? Why? How is you feel threat? How is you safe space? Only then this particular, then you can pick specific knowledge, specific what all people were hearing about here, specific methodologies, how to address emotions, how to address empathy. And again, I think for me, based on all my experience, international work in international settings, the design of the process, it's a long process. It's not like, oh, okay, let's put people together.
So I think there's a theme that I've heard throughout the panels today, a kind of thread that I want to stress test a little bit. And it's this idea that like when we interact with people in person, when we get to know them, it brings out their humanity and it makes these conversations easier. In the first panel, somebody asked a question about like, you know, people online basically cosplaying anger and rage. And I said, you know, I've met pundits and sort of flamethrowers online in person, and 90% of the time they're totally different in person than they conduct themselves online. And it's genuinely shocking when I meet them, members of Congress, you know, political pundits, whatever else. And so, and you talked about it too, like you know, we don't have the blockbuster experience anymore. And if we did, this would help. But it occurs to me, I mean, I wrote this down when you guys were talking, you know, thinking about global conflict. I mean, Israel, Palestine, China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, Georgian, Armenian, India, Pakistan. These are groups that they have a shared cultural history. Sometimes they share languages. They're close. They know each other. They're not just geographically close, which explains why they might be fighting, but they really share histories and they understand each other. And I guess my question is like, what happens when we do that, when we get to know the group and then we're like, oh, I hate you. Like, I actually don't like you. I mean, like Israelis and Palestinians, I think they understand each other in a lot of respects quite well. They don't get along. Same with India and Pakistan. I think in some respects they understand each other quite well, but they don't get along. So like we have these like the campus events you talk about. We go, we meet, and what if it doesn't go well? Then what? That's kind of like, I think what occurs to me is like, what happens at that next stage? Because I feel like we've been talking a lot as if we just take it into the real world, then everything will be fine. But it's clearly not how it works out all the time. And this is for anybody.
So I think, sorry.
I was just going to say, my colleague Karina Korostelina just did a massive study on contact theory. And so I just want to say one thing, sorry. One of the things that many practitioners in peace building have learned is that debates about the past are sources of continued destruction. But there is a kind of more, it's hard to say more promise or less destructive, is talking about a vision of the future. That how do we work together to address grievances? But debates about history also, Karina has extensive research on history memory. Memory is identity. And one thing that's clear about memory is it's about the present and the future. You know, memory is all about the present and future, and maybe occasionally about actual facts. So one technique is to focus less on the past and more on future, as it were, addressing grievances, assuming people are talking to each other, which is a big assumption, obviously not happening in Israel and Gaza.
We work too much together because I was just going to say that history is not about past, but about the future. But what is important, what is history? Again, I'm a social psychologist. I see history or memory is a deep belief in particular connotation of intergroup relations. What they did to us, how we blame and what we should do. It's a lot of normative prescriptions in how we interpret the history. So then we speak about understanding. I don't believe in understanding in conflicts because there are so many mechanisms which really create very strange picture of the other through attribution error, from cognitive dissonances, right? From bandwagon effects. That are like, I can just go for hours telling all these cognitive biases and emotional issues, how we live together we never understand and we don't want to share. Just go to Middle East and ask who invented hummus. Right? So, exactly. So, and you will hear stories, right? So this is living together doesn't mean understanding. And what is really important, then you look into how people work together, is trying to find some ways where there is no real deep misunderstanding or or conflict dynamics. 2 days ago, I was doing consultation for the member of parliament opposition in Venezuela. And they have this very interesting project, Community of Practice. In Venezuela, think about it, right? They actually have 60 people working across political divide. It's doctors, it's priests, it's teachers, some members of parliament, some members of government. And these people united because they want to help women to have more access to resources and has human rights. So what they doing, they learning how to build trust slowly, how to actually understand each other slowly across this divide. Then it's time for Venezuela to actually unite. There will be community of practice which actually work across divide. Very similar in Ukraine. I could not, give details, but there is a group of Russian and Ukrainian women which work together right now and have this dialogue, which is, we could not reveal who is that and how it's happening. But this is a moment, this is these spaces where people start developing this very first trust, very first ideas, which actually help. But I would never, speak about understanding as a foundation for conflict resolution.
Go ahead.
Let me just add quickly, I think we have to also be humble about what we can achieve and what we can expect. If we go into this kind of work with our eyes wide open, we can realize the limits of what we can do. I mean, I think that's important. My experience, I'm just speaking from this one experience of working with Patrick Henry's students and faculty, was that we only got so far. And that was pretty damn far, if I may say so. But at the end of the day, did we change political perspectives in a fundamental way? Probably not. But we opened the door for these students to begin to sort of recognize what was going on around them in the society. So maybe the more of them who sort of were sensitive to that would begin to rethink the choices they were making in their political lives, right? So there's this iterative process. But I was always kind of brought down to earth when I realized, working with my partner there, Patrick Henry, that after the storming of the Capitol and so on, we got together and we did a sort of in-your-shoes session, and he basically provided a pretty intense defense of what had happened. And I was sort of shocked. I said, we've been working together for an entire year and you're telling me this? I thought we were, well, I mean, this is a long process. You know, in the United States tomorrow, if we could get rid of a lot of the political polarization by introducing electoral reform. We all know what the electoral reforms are that would change the way we choose candidates, and it would be transformative. In the few states that has happened, in Maine and Alaska, this has happened. But of course, we also know the barriers to this. We can't do it because we are polarized. So we need to sort of work on that level, but I think we have to be sort of realistic about the kinds of things we can achieve, because this is a long-term battle, right? A long-term struggle, and it requires patience, and it requires recognizing what can change and how difficult other things are to change.
All right, I have a million more questions, but I think every panel so far we've had to cut off some of the audience Q&A before we finish. So maybe it'd be good to pivot there now with 10 or 15 minutes left. And there's a mic up there and one down here, and Randy can pass it around. But if you have a question, you just want to raise your hand or step up to one of the mics, we can do it that way.
So I'm actually going to exercise a little bit of host prerogative here.
Please.
And ask a question myself, because this is something that I am deeply invested in. The idea of a network of practitioners and researchers focused on depolarization in this country. So for me, one of the things that I've been thinking about and wanting to come from this is, what does that look like? What is the next step? What would you folks most like to see when it comes to creating a network where you can share your research and your interventions and really move forward together as a field? So yes, I would love to hear what that looks like.
I would like to see conservative scholars engaged. I don't know, like maybe I'm making assumptions, but I would like to see more conservative scholars engaged. I really want, I believe that this is a building trust across and understanding perspective and understanding these safe spaces which we can discuss the issues. But I also believe in building very deep trust within us, because we're academics, we have our own spaces, and we, this is normal for academics, believe that our conceptual framework is the most important conceptual framework, right? So I think building trust and learning how other conceptual frameworks can help and enhance, and this is a great opportunity to really have this cross-fertilization of different approaches and different ideas. These panels, thank you, these conversations is unbelievable, come from different perspectives, but we all coming into this idea. But again, I believe more conservative scholars should be involved. And as I told you, I would love to have like socials and fites, and yes.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as a practitioner and circulating amongst practitioners, it's immensely useful to hear the research that we've heard today and to stay current and to keep informing each other. I think I really like the way that this mix came together and I'm appreciative of it, and would really love to meet and have time to share some more on that front. So.
Let me just say very quickly that, Randy, it's a great question. I think one of the things we can do is think about, and I think we recognize one of the challenges is how to bring more conservatives, but conservatives come in multiple colors and perspectives, and MAGA so-called conservatives are not really conservative in so many ways. We know this, and there's the big challenge. When in my course on polarization at Georgetown, I have to kill myself to get people in the class who disagree with one another, because of course it's just pure Georgetown, and how are we going to do this kind of work? But one way to do this is to go back to the literature on reframing, in which makes the case that in order to speak to somebody about a particular subject, you pick those symbols that are most cherished to that person or to that movement, and you speak through those symbols. And I think that the idea of creating networks is about as patriotic and as American a tradition as you can think of, right? It's really extraordinary. It goes back to Tocqueville. It's the beating heart of America in so many ways. And I say this because a few weeks ago, I don't know if you encountered this, there was a British documentary film person going through the United States looking at polarization, interviewing all kinds of folks, and he said he was absolutely amazed by the number of organizations established everywhere he went to deal with polarization, because nothing like that exists in the European context. When people stand up and they start forming their organizations, it sounds like I'm being romanticizing this, but it's true. It's deeply American, if I may say so. So we have to be able to sort of speak that language and talk about it. We're not here to convince you of this progress, but we're here to speak about what it means to be a patriotic citizen, and it means to go back to a tradition and embed it in, and that's, I think, a case that we can make very strongly.
All right, I think maybe we'll move into some audience Q&A.
Hey, thank you for coming here to discuss this. So with all the conflict going on right now and the studies being done about peace and transformation of the mind, how do you think after the election, the next presidential, after everybody votes and depending on who's the next president, how do you think that will affect what is done from a peace or standpoint?
Who's got that? That's a great and hard question. So I'll try. Obviously, there are deeper forces that are at work here, and those forces are not going to go away after November 5th. I don't have a crystal ball, but there are, some, whatever, 40% or 45% are going to think of themselves as having lost the election. And what happens, what happens? And everything that we're saying now is going to be more intense, I think. That's the only thing I'll predict. It will become more intense for the 45 or whatever percent who feel that they lost the election and the country is being stolen and there's existential crisis and the world will come to an end. I'm paraphrasing. So everything that we're saying now, I think, would become more focused and more urgent.
Thank you. My name is Elle Edwards. Elle is in Elijah. I really appreciated the opening remarks that Karina made on the different forms of justice. I wasn't aware of that. My question is kind of directed to Dan in the nice purple getup, not other Dan, but I'm in media, so I kind of want to hide behind my hat because it seems like media has been a source of a lot of the problems in the room. But I'm also in education, media education, and that's kind of why I've stayed it so long, because I want to be part of the solutions. So directed to Dan, when I was thinking of my question towards you, I was thinking of sports. In sports, how there's a lot of tribalism. Take NBA today, we have one of the panelists, Big Perk. He's kind of like a big Celtics fan, and he will sing the praises, but at the same time, he will acknowledge the personhood of the other teams. He'll say, okay, that was a good play by the other team. You talked about, and I'm not sure if it's just theory, but you talked about seeing the humanism in different people and going down that road to kind of combat that tribalism and even some of that rage. So my question is, as somebody who is kind of representing my own media company today, how can we form that dialogue, whether it's in film or if it's in writing? How can we start that conversation so that we are not thinking of ourselves as those other animals, but as more of humanity to be the solution instead of some of that problem?
Oh dear. I was going to start this morning when I had originally planned to come to talk about the Comedy of Errors at the Shakespeare play that's on now. It's an extraordinary play, and I was going to read from Drew Lichtenberg's description of the play, because this is a play about sort of knowing other people and interacting and knowing other strangers, and it turns out the stranger's your brother. And there's a lot of storytelling out there in the media about sort of the experience of experiencing other people, and I think there's a lot to draw from. Now, a lot of it isn't so much contemporary to the media anymore, which tends to reflect the tribalism process. But I think that I talk to my students. That sounds almost archaic, but I talk a lot to my students about comedies that were created to talk about family and recognition of the others. And so many of them have not seen some of the comedies that I grew up in. But those programs, like Cheers, is about sort of everybody knows your name. And so what I get my students to do is I get them to watch this stuff. I get them to sit and appreciate that depiction of interactions that they don't have so much in their lives anymore. And that draws them into imagining their own sort of version of Cheers, or their own version of that environment where they can become those sort of people. So you are essentially modeling that kind of behavior. So the more contemporary versions of that, because Shakespeare is not terribly contemporary, but the more we can model that in the media itself, because I know how difficult it is, the more students can look and young people can look at that and say, oh, you know what? God, look at that experience. You walk into that bar, everybody knows your name, and there's a kind of magic that happens. But of course, that's an ancient show as far as the kids these days are concerned. But there's a lot out there that they could use to have, because this is experiential. People have to experience the emotion of having that experience. They have to do it. They have to feel it. And they feel it in a classroom or in music. My students came up with a whole set of ideas about teaching comedy on the Hill, believe it or not. You know, improv. I think it's a great idea. Of course, is how to do it, how to get that moving, right? But there too, that's kind of an experience of the humanity of the other person. So comedy is another arena. So there are multiple ways to do this, I think.
I just want to add something, actually. I mean, I'm a politics reporter and I run my own media organization, and there's like a challenge that I navigate. And I would say like a tangible thing that we do is we hire people with ideological diversity. And I think like, depending on what kind of work you're doing, I don't know what specific media work you're doing, but like if you want to tell the story in a way that reaches certain people, then involve them in the process of creating the story, right? I mean, my politics are all over the place. I consider myself like something close to a centrist or a moderate. I happen to have really strong pro-choice feelings. So like when my organization is covering abortion, I have a female writer on staff who is pro-life and religious. She gets first crack at editing it because I know that I wrote it in a way that is informed by my biases and worldviews, and I literally am intentional about like she's the first eyes on it, because that's the only way to just like have somebody covering your blind spots and actually balance the language, and it works. She like points things out, like you say this, it's going to trigger XYZ, or she like points out flaws in my argument or the framing of the story. It's really effective. So I would just say like try your best to, I mean, it's not always possible, but try your best to include the people in the process of building that story.
That's a great story, by the way. And it's amazing that you're doing this kind of work. Imagine taking that experience and drawing a play out of it. That you could dramatize to folks what it's like to have because you're doing it in real time with your colleagues. But imagine projecting it out and sharing that experience so people can put themselves in your shoes and say, oh, look what can be achieved by doing media work in a different way.
Actually, this is a good example. I actually have one of my books is called Trump Effect. I wrote it before Trump became a president, how he used insults, aggression, and different other mechanisms to empower. So then I wrote the book. It was very good psychotherapy for me while he was running. But then I wrote this book. I also asked several of my conservative friends to read through it. And I teach students about that. Because if I write advocacy book, who will read it? Only those who already agree with me. So I really want people who I might change, maybe 5% of minds of other people. But being as much as representing different views, or at least not advocacy in your scholarship, is very, very important part to reach out to others. Because if you just want to support those who already think the same, it's a great idea, but it's not what conflict resolution practitioners do. It's not what conflict resolution is about. So I support this, but I wanted to give another point, and about the basic human needs for self-esteem. We have this very, very basic, this is the very first idea of social identity theory. We have a need for positive self-esteem, so we compare ourselves with others, and in this comparison we put other people down, which we called favorable comparison. And we all do it in different ways. It depends on how we compare and so on. But what is key here, then media works. It's very important to create this commonality as feel good. It's increasing self-esteem. And I'm thinking about American identity, being an American. There is a very good documentary. If you never saw it, I strongly recommend Eye of the Storm. It's about experiment, brown eyes, blue eyes experiment in a school in Ohio. So this is the way, in the end, children were singing together I'm proud to be an American. And I'm immigrant myself, I'm from Ukraine. And sometimes when I hear, oh, America, it's so awful, I think it's not what you really want to really think about your country. Critical thinking, extremely important. Critical view, how slavery was executed, the segregation, right? And so, but we also have to look what we already done. And me working internationally, I work probably around 30 countries around the globe. So I'm proud to be an American. And I think this is a very, very important part which we need to bring. And I think this self-esteem message should be there. Not, I hate this country, it had slavery how many years ago, right? So it's really about what we done with that, where we went now.
I think maybe we have time for one more.
Dr. Korostelina, you gave me a perfect segue. You had mentioned that having a national civic identity can improve peace processes. And so I was going to ask, do you have any practical recommendations for what we could do in the US to strengthen that sense of national civic identity and maybe some aspects of American culture that have helped us to bridge divisions positively in the past that we could draw on? And also, Dr. Brumberg, if you remember the name of the British film about polarization, I'd love to watch that.
I have the card back in my office somewhere. I'll get it to you. Just let me know you're recording.
This is a wonderful question. There are so many already done. I do believe in education. That's why we're all here, right? Because we believe in education. I do believe it should start from as early as possible, any type of civic education, civic engagement. There are so many things already done. There is a huge field of peace education. There is a huge field. And what is important is to really socialize children in being engaged across divides. Socialize children. There is, for a long time, it's just maybe like sounds silly a little bit, but for a long time, it was believed in science, social science and pedagogy, that children born good and then we make them bad. Now more and more studies showing it's completely opposite. Children won't fight for themselves, to be completely exclusive, to completely think about their own security. And it's us who socialize them to be good. We're teaching them what good, what is bad. We're teaching them to be more engaging with. So I believe that the ways how civic identities develop this pride. In Taiwan, then they decided to exclude completely, and in Singapore they did actually the same. They excluded the history education from required classes because they wanted technological progress. Let's study physics, engineering, like history, who needs it? What happened? Children were graduating and leaving. Because they know loyalty, right? To the country, no pride of who we are and what we achieved. So again, this is very important to use all already existing ideas, but I would start from kindergarten. I was really will go there and teaching children to listen to each other. Like all the skills which we teach in university, it should be like this conflict transformation labs in every kindergarten.
All right. How about a round of applause for our panelists? And also to Randy for putting all this together, and an excellent day. Thank you, Randy.
And thank you for being a wonderful.
Thank you, absolutely.
Yes, thank you so much, Isaac, for the amazing moderation. Thank you so much to these panelists. This was an incredible conversation. I am really grateful for these folks, for all of the folks who have been here today. I want to close with just a few really personal words about what we've heard. A few weeks ago, I was in Philadelphia doing something called deep canvassing, and it starts with a story. And when we heard from the panel that was focused on narrative, it really is about stories that connect us. And I think we heard that from every panel, that it is really about figuring out ways for us to connect on a really deep level, and we need to continue to focus on that. And my experience deep canvassing was incredible. We got to register voters, and it was transformative. I highly recommend the experience if you get a chance. I also met someone who I really resonated with on that deep canvas. So and she's here today. And I also want to mention shared spaces, because there was the mention of those shared spaces that we have as Americans kind of going away. And I am deeply concerned about that. So you can see the logo for my consultancy. I'm one of the sponsors here, Depolarizing Organizational Cultures. And it's based around the idea that organizations are a shared space that we can use as a venue for depolarization, because they bring us together. We are much more diverse in our colleagues than we tend to be with our friends, and that's a really important insight that I think that we need to use as a country. It's not just the organizations where we work; it's also the organizations we volunteer, and plenty of other types of organizations. So. Yeah, that really resonates with me, and I think that you heard some really good insights that align with that. And then finally, I want to mention representation. The folks that you saw on this panel, well, it was pointed out there was not a big conservative presence here, and I recognize that. That's something with my Braver Angels background is highly emphasized. The balance of representation, and I think that's really important. And there's other representation that is important as well. The folks that you've seen today largely look similar. And interestingly enough, one might think that this conference is a vast Jewish conspiracy, because lots of the folks who are involved are from the tribe. And I also want to mention that, I pulled this panel together based on the folks that I had been connecting with, especially in researching conflict resolution master's programs. And so this was a sample that is largely because of who I personally have been exposed to. And I recognize that representation could be better. One of our volunteers, Spencer, asked me, well, did you reach out to anyone at Howard or Gallaudet? And I hadn't. There was reasons for that. Those places were not on my radar, but maybe they should have been. And I would like to do better in that regard in the future. I'd like to do better in that in terms of conservative representation as well, right? So I think that we have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of work to do. I recognize with regard to representation, but I definitely look forward to doing that work in the future. And so. Yeah, with that, I want to just also close by saying I want to mention the information that's on the screen. If you haven't already signed up through the Eventbrite, please subscribe for some updates. I definitely want this to be something that starts something bigger. And so that's the QR code on the left. In the middle there, you can still support this and future events like this. So would love to have your support. And the QR code on the right, of course, is for Tangle, because I have been reading that newsletter for years, and it is absolutely a fantastic way to understand perspectives that are different from your own. And I think that is so important. We've heard that in spades today. So I would definitely encourage you to check out Tangle and make it part of your media diet. And I think I also want to thank the staff for the Bloomberg Center. We are 50 minutes past the time that we were supposed to end, and they are sticking with us, going strong, and so grateful for all those folks. I also want to thank the fellow Carter School students who stepped up and gave their time and energy to this event. Ksenia Bakhtiarova, Prerna Barua, Satoria Brent, Spencer Jones. Spencer was the gentleman I mentioned who called me out on the representation issue, and Mary Amy Tanner. I couldn't have done this without you folks. And special thanks to my parents, Carol and Larry Liaz, who ran all over town with me yesterday to make sure that you were all fed, and also stayed up last night stuffing your name badges. So I really appreciate that. To everyone who came and contributed, thank you so much. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you at events soon once again. Thanks. Oh yes, Lily has mentioned that this building actually has a piece of the Berlin Wall. This was formerly the Newseum, as many of you know, and so if you, before the exit sign there, if you take a right and you wanna see that on the way out, definitely encourage you to do that. So, thanks once again.